Bill Benjamin, welcome to the Principal Podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Arch, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Hey, you have been introduced to me as the expert on EQ, emotional intelligence, and I've seen quite a bit of your work online. So I figured, why not open up the conversation? But before we do that, could you just give us a brief introduction on yourself, your background, how you got involved in this line of work?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, whenever I get called an expert in emotional intelligence, I just think, yeah, my teenage daughters do not think that. Well, thanks for asking. I have a very unique path to being a speaker on the topic of emotional intelligence because I have degrees in mathematics and computer science.
Right.
And how I came to this is I was working at a computer software company and I had done well. I was a high performer. And of course, what do organizations do with their high performers? Well, they promote them and make them a manager. Problem was I wasn't a very good manager. My mentors, about leading and coaching were my high school basketball coaches or what I see on TV of college football coaches. And don't you just run around and yell at everyone and tell them what to do? Well, it turns out that's not a very good leadership style. So I really struggled with this area of, motivating and managing people and leading change and all the things that we're expected to do as a leader. And it was at that time that my business partner in the Institute for Health and Human Potential, that I got exposed to this work. So it's over 25 years ago. And the thing that really attracted me, because at first when I heard emotional intelligence as a math guy, I'm like, oh, that's all soft and squishy. But when my business partner explained the brain science of it and what happens to us emotionally, how that impacts our brain, how that impacts our behavior, I really recognized that was the thing I was struggling with. And so it really resonated for me. And it really helped me. It helped me not only, kind of be a better leader at this computer software company, but it actually helped me in my personal life too.
Got it. And were you just for my own benefit, were you in a sales role at this computer software company?
I was.
Okay.
Yes.
Got it. So you were naturally kind of an extroverted person, weren't afraid to put yourself out there. And then, as you worked your way up through the ranks, you became a manager. Got it. I'm really glad you said the thing about, when I first heard about EQ, emotional intelligence, I just thought this was soft and squishy. So I kind of dismissed it, right? Because I feel like the majority of people still do that in today's world, right? People haven't necessarily come to understand the benefits of understanding emotional intelligence and having enough emotional intelligence to deal with your peers in whatever capacity that might be. So I'm really glad you brought up that point. Why do you think that still gets ignored? Why do you think that there hasn't been a lot of exposure to this topic, to this subject?
Well, I think the more and more complex our world gets in terms of technologies, in terms of product, in terms of data analytics, there's a higher level of IQ and technical skills required to do your, kind of frontline jobs.
Sure.
So your individual contributor jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So people, they learn, they develop, they become successful based on their IQ and technical skills. So when they get promoted to a job where actually IQ and technical skills, which has been proven by research, are not critical, that the people skills, the emotional intelligence skills are, they don't recognize that. They think, okay, well, this is what got me here, my IQ, my technical skills. So that's what's going to, make me be successful in a leadership role. So it amazes me that after 20 years of doing this, I'm in front of, multiple audiences every month where they're still wondering, yeah, does emotional intelligence really matter?
Yeah. Yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from on sentiment on that, because you always, every time, especially at my age, like, every time you're looking to get into a certain career path, or even if you're giving people advice, they're always talking about, oh, okay, what hard skills do I need to jump into this career? Like, do I need to learn a programming language, for example? And then you get so good at that when you do end up working your way through the ranks, you forget how to have those soft skills, and you forget that you still need to continue developing those soft skills.
Yeah.
So that becomes very critical at that point too.
I will say that the good news is more and more organizations are recognizing the importance of interpersonal skills, of resilience skills, of ability to collaborate, and that there is a real business outcome for those. There's a lot of research to back that up. So more and more organizations are starting to recognize that and invest in that kind of training, more so at the leadership level right now. And for some organizations, it is starting to trickle down to frontline supervisors and even individual contributors.
Sure. Okay. So all that being said, How do you define EQ?
Yeah, there's really two aspects to it. So our definition is the first part is the ability to understand and recognize and manage our own emotions.
Mm-hmm.
That's the self part. The second part is the ability to understand and recognize and influence the emotions of others. So that's how I'm showing up for others. That's how I'm connecting, influencing, demonstrating empathy. It's also, how I build, relationships with trust and respect so that I can step in and do some of the more difficult things. So one of the other things that I think, turns people off of emotional intelligence, they think it's only about being nice to people, getting them to like you. And it's not. I mean, connecting, empathizing, people feeling trust and feeling valued by you is absolutely critical. But the other part of it is to do those difficult things, like have that tough conversation with someone,
Right.
give them difficult feedback,
Yeah.
make a difficult decision that they don't agree with or that somebody won't like or will be disappointed by. We by the way, we call those last 8% moments because we're all pretty good at the 92% of moments when everybody's getting along, when everyone's agreeing. But as soon as there's that last 8% decision where not everyone's going to agree, or, I get into a conversation and I'm 85, I'm 90, 92% of the way there. And as I start to give the feedback and they know where this conversation is going, they start to get defensive. Now I react. And most people, 68% in our research in that moment, they avoid. They kind of step back. They don't fully step in and say that last 8%. So our work is all about giving people the tools and skills to create connected relationships where there's trust and respect. And then also to develop the courage and skills to step in and do what's difficult. And again, I think that's another reason that people don't really understand what emotional intelligence is, that it's also about doing that tough stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where the disconnect really is, right? Because the first part of that was all about yourself, right? How do I get in touch with my own emotions? How do I know what I'm feeling? How do I know how to respond to certain emotions that I'm feeling inside me, right? And so that's the kind of like, sure, that's kind of the mushy stuff that people
Well,
get a
and
little
the
bit.
only thing, the thing we add to that to make it a little less mushy
Yep.
is how do I recognize what my brain does when I'm under pressure, when I'm stressed, when I'm overwhelmed, when I feel emotionally triggered. So
Mhm.
we add that brain science piece into it, which is what opens, because I've delivered this to US Marines, I've delivered this to NASA engineers, I've delivered this to surgeons. So the way we get them to open up and really be, accept this is the brain science aspect of it.
Yeah.
So you're right. A lot of the self-awareness stuff can sound really soft and squishy, but when you put brain science to it, that people get and go, yeah, that happens to me, it really
Mhm.
opens them up.
Yeah. And what I was going to say was like when you introduce how understanding emotional intelligence can impact your relationships, especially like basically the entire thing that you said on part 2 of EQ, right?
Mhm.
That entire thing on part 2 of EQ is exactly why people should be paying attention to this stuff, right? Because
Yes.
you're not doing everything that you do alone, right? You're doing this with other people. So how can you influence people? How can you persuade people? How can you
Yeah.
get people on your side? All of these things are very important.
Yeah. And the other thing, we're talking about the business application. That's the focus of most of our work.
Sure.
Most of the people sitting in an audience emotions show up at home too, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
emotional intelligence is something that really impacts us in our personal lives. And that's one of the great things about the work is it isn't just about work. It's also about our home life.
Yeah. Yeah. So you something you mentioned was that you teach people to, I guess, tell me if I'm off base here, but you teach people to be a little less reactive, calm under pressure, under tense situations. What are
Hmm.
some strategies that you employ for teaching people how to do that?
Yeah. And so where we start before we get to strategies is in self-awareness.
Okay.
You have to recognize what's happening first.
Mhm.
So that self-awareness, I mentioned the brain science. And what we share with people, the insight that people gain is that we have two parts to our brain.
Mhm.
There's our cognitive brain where we do all our best thinking, our strategizing, our prioritizing, our listening, our innovating, creativity is all in that cognitive part of our brain.
Yep.
Then there's the emotional part of our brain, which is centered in a small almond-sized part of the brain called the amygdala. And that emotional center is also the part of our brain that handles our fight or flight responses. So what we know is that in the design of the brain, when we feel threatened by something, the emotional brain, it jumps into the driver's seat first. It will
Sure.
start to take over our
Yeah,
thinking. It will start to actually limit our cognitive thinking capacity. It actually reduces our ability to think complex thoughts
sure. Because your
because
emotions
it's
have taken over.
yes,
Yeah.
because it's the same system that reacts. Let's say you're in the jungle, and I know your listeners probably don't spend a lot of time in the jungle, but go with me. It's a good metaphor. A
Yep.
tiger jumps out at you
Yep.
within 85 milliseconds. This amygdala, this emotional part of your system, senses the threat from the tiger, immediately causes a cascade of chemicals first into the body. The blood moves to the major muscle groups. Your heart rate increases. Your breathing shortens. You're ready for fight or flight. The amygdala also reduces chemicals into the brain that reduces our cognitive thinking capacity.
Mhm.
So we can't think because it doesn't have time to think, gee, how can I best collaborate with the tiger?
Right. The
Right?
tiger's gonna rip your face off by then.
Yeah, right. It wants you
Yep.
to react right away. So fight or
Sure.
flight,
Yep.
which is why in the middle of a difficult conversation, when the other person's starting to get defensive,
Mhm.
the emotional system kicks in as if that's a tiger, will limit our thinking capacity and move us to either avoid or fight back, which is the other. Remember, I said 68% of people, their natural emotional reaction is to avoid. But then there's the other 32% that fight is their response. And we call that making a mess. So we talk about people being either avoiders or make a messers.
What about the people, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought, but what about the people that might freeze up in that moment, right? They freeze up in that moment and they're not exactly sure how to react, so they just say something and hope that it gets their point across and then try to exit the conversation. I guess they are avoiding, but
Yeah.
do you see that with some of your clients as well, that they just freeze up and don't know how to act?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really is fight, flight, or freeze. That's a really great point. In fact, I was coaching a woman yesterday
Mhm.
who is in some training programs that we do. And I've actually seen her, in a group interaction freeze when she feels put on the spot and she
Mhm.
just can't speak. So because her emotional system is taken over, she's, in front of others feeling, the pressure. And so absolutely freeze is one of the responses. So I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but you're giving somebody difficult news and they're just staring at you. They can't hear the feedback. They're triggered. They can't, they're not thinking clearly.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I just keep going and say, oh, I'm just going to give them all the feedback, and then well, if they don't get it, that's their problem.
Yeah,
Yet
yeah.
I'm the one who's not recognizing that they've been triggered emotionally, and they're not really hearing the feedback. So freeze is absolutely one of the responses. Um, so in our work, this is where, and again, everybody resonates with this, right? Because everybody has an amygdala. Everybody, and by the way, when the amygdala gets triggered, releases the chemicals and reduces that working memory, we call that an amygdala hijack.
Okay.
Because
And
the
then
amygdala can literally hijack our thinking brain, get the cognitive brain out of the driver's seat, move into the driver's seat, and take over. Just like a hijack would take over a plane. So what people are learning is, okay, what are my early warning signs? How do I know that I'm starting to trigger? Because the
Mhm.
body is the early warning system. What in fact are my triggers? So identifying what our triggers are. How do I know, and then what's the emotion behind, why am I getting triggered? This person's saying this thing to me. Why is they're really getting into the understanding our emotional needs? I'm not feeling respected. I didn't feel included. I don't feel like I can be successful. Whatever it is, there's an emotional need behind it. So that's all the stuff that's in self-awareness. And, essentially I'm describing a half day of our training program. But that's the work that we do. So I'm going to get to the strategy part, but you can't do the strategies until you have that self-awareness and that recognition of what's
Right.
happening to you.
100%. I totally get what you're saying, because you don't want to be reactive. That's the problem in the first place, right? Is that you're being reactive to an external
Correct.
stimulus, if you will. You want to be thoughtful in how you respond.
Exactly.
Is
And
that
the
fair?
amygdala does not cognate.
Yep.
It doesn't think about the future and the consequence. It simply reacts.
Sure.
It only knows about the present and the past. So
Mhm.
you're right. We don't want to be reacting from that emotionally triggered state. So the goal is, from a self-awareness emotional management standpoint, is can I, in the face of that pressure, in the face of tension and conflict, yes, can I show up and be skillful and then make good choices about how I show up? Because we're not saying don't demonstrate emotion. Emotion can be incredibly impactful. It's that we want to be proactive about it. So Martin Luther King Jr. is an example of a man who was very angry, yet channeled it really skillfully. Right? That's what made him so powerful. Is you could feel his, you could feel the sense of injustice and unfairness and anger that he had, and it was justified. And so we're not saying don't demonstrate emotion. You just don't want it to be reactive. You want it to be proactive. So I'll go back to your original question, which is, well, how the heck do you do that? And it's very difficult because by design, as soon as we feel emotionally triggered, we start to lose our thinking capacity.
Yep.
And so it becomes hard. So, we teach people to start by working on kind of less triggering situations. So you're in the grocery, the 12 items or less gross checkout, grocery line, you're running a little late, and somebody two in front of you has 14 items, because you counted. Okay, that's a great place to stop. So we have a strategy called the SOS.
Yep.
And we actually originally developed a strategy with the U.S. Navy over 20 years ago, actually almost 25 years ago now. So intentionally use the SOS metaphor because it was the Navy. And the first S is stop and disconnect from the trigger. Now, that's not an avoidance strategy. It's to disconnect from the trigger so that you can re-engage more skillfully. So you can come back with that thoughtful response or with that choice to emote, right? But just not do it reactively.
So that's taking the amygdala out of the driver's seat, if you will.
Exactly. It's like a pattern interrupt.
Okay.
Exactly. And so just that ability to disconnect, and it can be something as simple as drinking a glass of water.
Yep.
It can be something as simple as if you're in fight mode, you're going to be leaning forward, you just lean back. So there's writing something down. There's all kinds of things you can do to kind of create that pattern interrupt. If you're by yourself and you got that email that really frustrates you and you're about to go type, reply to all, right? And add two people. That's where you step back. By the way, you use the draft folder. The draft folder was designed for emotional intelligence. So you write that email that you want to write, get it out. Don't put anybody in the to list just in case. Get up, go for a walk, change your body posture, come back and look at that email. And I can tell you, I've done this a number of times. Never once have I looked at that email and said, yeah, that's the email I should send. Right? That's me at my best.
That one stays in the drafts.
I should pick up the phone and call this person or get on a Zoom call with them and talk to them. So the first S in that SOS strategy is to find a way to disengage from the trigger so that you can re-engage more skillfully.
Got it. Okay.
6 seconds, I'm going to say 6 seconds, is the amount of time between when the stimulus triggers your amygdala and your neocortex catches up. So it is appropriate to stop for as little as 6 seconds in any situation. I've delivered this to surgeons, as I mentioned, and they would tell me, yeah, unless there's literally an emergency on the operating table that has to be responded to right away, which is very rare, during the operation, if there's something that's not quite going right, they can stop for the 6 seconds or 10 seconds and take time to disconnect and reconnect. So you've got, as little as 6 seconds. Whether you're pausing or stopping for 6 seconds, 6 minutes, 6 hours, in that time, you want to oxygenate. That's the O in the SOS strategy. The intake of a large amount of oxygen carbonizes our blood, which has the physiological effect of minimizing the effect of the chemicals the amygdala has released. So you're literally fighting chemistry with chemistry. So that is just a deep conscious breath. And when I'm in actually, you know what? Let's just stop right now. I want all you and all the listeners to stop right now and take a deep conscious breath. I tell people if they do nothing else as a result of, being in my keynote session or being in our training, but the next time that person says that thing, you get that email or that idiot just cuts you off on the highway. If you stop and take a deep breath, you will get more of your best self back. It will calm down a bit. Because when we are triggered, we become more self-referential. We become more reactive and judgmental. It's just not a good place to operate and try and connect from. So that deep breath calms us down and gets some of that cognitive thinking back. It actually dissipates the chemicals in the brain and allows us now to step in and try to be more skillful. So the deep breathing, the oxygenating is a critical part of the strategy. Now, in this SOS strategy, at this point, you'll notice we haven't done any cognitive thinking. We've done things like go for a walk, drink some water, lean back. We're breathing. Now that we've got a little bit of working memory back, now the third part, the second S, is seek information. And in particular, seek information that will help calm this emotional system. Because by design, this emotional system amplifies the negative. And it makes sense. If you're in the jungle and there's a tiger around and you hear wind rustling in the bushes, what do you assume the wind is? We assume it's a tiger, right? Now there's two tigers. There's the real one and there's the one you're imagining. Yeah, you will start to react to the wind like it's an actual tiger. So we get a little bit of information. Oh, that person sent me that text. We amplify the negative. We assume the worst, and now we're reacting. So we want to seek information. Like, gosh, is this person really meaning to criticize me? Does this really mean I'm going to lose my job? Does this really mean my boss is mad at me? Because we make all these assumptions. So we want to check, seek information. Is this wind or tiger?
And how do you create a distinction between seeking information and starting to overthink, right? Because like you just said, you receive that text or you receive that email and you start thinking, oh man, this is going to lead to this. And then this is going to have a domino effect here. And there's going to be all these things, right? And you start overthinking. At least I do. I don't know if other people do, but
of course they do.
So how do you create that distinction between seeking information and overthinking?
Yeah. I mean, now you're getting into the area of what I would call mindfulness.
Yep.
And so that's a whole other podcast we can do.
Yeah.
It's a whole other podcast, but you're being aware of what's happening to your thoughts. And you're aware that, no, right now I need some information because I'm feeling triggered and I'm lacking. And we make most of our jump to judgment decisions based on less than 5% of available information. So to be aware that I'm consciously requiring more information versus, no, I have the information I need. Now I'm just ruminating about it. Now I'm just imagining all the negative outcomes. So that's really that mindfulness and awareness of my thoughts. And so to me, that's how that's where you differentiate between, no, I'm seeking information that I genuinely don't have versus I'm just ruminating right now.
Sure. I'm just letting my mind wander. The SOS method, is that what you call it? Is that what you refer to it as?
Yeah,
the SOS
strategy method.
Yep. That seems like much more of a skill that you develop over time.
Yes.
Than just something that you hear about once and right. Like it seems like something that you actually work on.
Oh, absolutely. I have people who, I go into an organization and I speak, and 7 years later, I'm at some other company and they come up to me and they're like, I saw you 7 years ago and I still have this note in my notebook that says SOS because it absolutely is a skill.
Yeah.
And that's the great, by the way, that's how we know that you can improve your emotional intelligence.
Right.
Because some people think, oh, well, you're just born with whatever your reactions are.
Yeah.
But these are skills you can learn. The emotional part of the brain can change. So if you can start to put these strategies into practice, you actually start to build new neural pathways. So instead of reacting and getting defensive, now I stop, take a deep breath, and ask a probing question. So we can change those default behaviors under pressure.
Yeah. And I think that the point you just made right there is actually pretty critical, because I've always heard emotional intelligence described, and maybe this is just because I'm hearing about emotional intelligence from the wrong people, but I've always heard it described as, that person has high emotional intelligence. It gives you the connotation that people are just born with emotional intelligence, or they just have it like because it's a genetic characteristic. Yeah. And I'm sure there's some merit to that, but it makes it seem, what you're saying makes it seem like you can really work on it over time and develop emotional intelligence and become a high EQ person.
You absolutely can. The other thing that people don't understand is that there's just like there's lots of different intelligences we know now, there's different aspects of emotional intelligence. So take a famous guy like Steve Jobs, who was known for flying off the handle and yelling at people. Well, he's not very emotionally intelligent. Well, think about him in terms of optimism and resilience and the things he's overcome. Think about in terms of adaptability and innovation. Think about him in terms of authenticity. He was very authentic. So Steve Jobs was off the charts in some areas of emotional intelligence and very low in others. So we all have various parts of emotional intelligence that we're strong at. He was pretty low on empathy. But again, pretty high on self-regard, self-confidence. So
Hmm.
again, there's various facets of emotional intelligence that
Right.
we can either have some strengths or areas to work on.
Yeah. It's more nuanced than you might think at first glance.
It's really more nuanced than the person that flies off the handle and they're not and again, a lot of people don't recognize that the person who's sitting being quiet in that moment might have something really important that they need to say, but they're not saying it. They're not being emotionally intelligent. Like, according to that definition of, oh, it's only the person who doesn't fly off the handle, well, they're being emotionally intelligent because they're not saying anything. No, they're not being emotionally intelligent because they're not stepping in. They're not speaking their truth. They're not saying that last 8%.
And that last 8%, that concept of the 92 and 8, just out of curiosity, where did that come from?
Yeah, great question. My business partner, Dr. JP Palou Fry, who founded our company, he was coaching a couple of executives and they weren't getting along. Imagine two executives not getting along, like that ever happens. And he had coached them to have a conversation with each other. And they came back from the conversation and he asked them, well, did you say, what you needed to say? Oh, yeah, they both say. Well, he probes a little further and both of them said, well, actually, I got 85, 90% of the way there. And he started reacting. And so I didn't really say everything. I said most of it. Did you say the most important part? That last part? No, I didn't say that last part. And so
Mm.
that's kind of where the concept came up with. Then we did a research study of 34,000 people and determined that, in fact, it is 8% that on average
Huh.
people feel they leave left unsaid in a difficult conversation. Same thing with decisions. On average, people feel that, well, there's 92% of the decisions I make every day, but there's that 8% that are the really tough ones. So we kind of verified the actual number through research.
Got it. Okay, so there is real research and science behind that 92.8. I thought it was just, oh, 92.8, that sounds really great because those are particular numbers to
Yeah.
assign to a concept like this.
It is
Um,
a metaphor, but I mean, we're a
yeah.
research and learning institute. So in everything we do, I had a client once say, I just want to know what you're doing isn't two guys with a bottle of wine one night
Yeah.
making stuff up.
Yeah.
So we always come at it from a research and brain science perspective because
Got
that's
it.
what I would want. I have degrees in
Yeah.
mathematics. I'm very logical. I'm analytical. I want the data and the research behind it.
Yeah, and frankly, that's another reason why I was so interested in having this conversation is because you've got a math and computer science degree. You're clearly very analytical and logical. And then on the other hand, there's this perception around emotional intelligence kind of being like a voodoo thing that people talk about. It's more theoretical, but
Yeah.
you're applying both of those together, and I think that's really important to look at it through that perspective.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, because of my background, I do get booked to speak
Yep.
to a lot of analytical audiences, technical audiences, engineers, as I said, doctors and surgeons, because they'll listen to me for 5 minutes, right? Oh, here's a guy with a math degree. He's like me.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, and by the way, he's saying he struggled with this stuff, and
Mhm.
so yeah, I do work. Ironically, though, because I have a sales background, I also end up speaking to sales audiences, so I'm a bit of a dichotomy with that.
There
Um,
you go.
but by the way, either group, first of all, they're all wired the same. We've delivered this training in 70 countries around the world. Doesn't matter
Mhm.
who you are, we're all wired with this emotional system. Some of the learned default behaviors are different. Some of the culturally accepted norms are different, but the wiring is all the same. So it doesn't matter if you're a salesperson or engineer or a surgeon, we all have the same wiring.
Mhm. Mhm. That's unique, and that's what makes you unique. And then there's that common thread among all of us that kind of ties it all in. I wanted to revisit something that you said earlier about Martin Luther King,
Mm,
and this was on the topic of emotion. You said Martin Luther King has a lot of anger, right? And
hmm.
so, from my perspective, anger has always been explained to me as something that is kind of a useless emotion. It's kind of a negative emotion.
Yeah,
It blinds us and it impairs us from having clear thoughts in one direction. Um, I want to have a conversation with you about anger. Is anger a useless emotion? Why? How can we control our anger to make it work in our favor,
yeah,
if
yeah,
if we can at all?
yeah. Um, I think the most important thing that I've learned about anger is that it's a secondary emotion.
Okay.
It's triggered by something else. In the case of Martin Luther King, injustice. It can be triggered by feeling like somebody has disrespected us. It can be triggered by just feeling like, somebody's not doing their part.
Mm-hmm.
It can be triggered by feeling out of control. So there's something underneath the anger. So anger can be really helpful in terms of, number one, motivating us to action, because often if we're not upset or angry or frustrated, we might not take action. So it can motivate us to action. But secondly, it can give us a signal that something underneath that, something has impacted us emotionally. Somebody's had an impact. A situation has caused us to feel there's not a fairness or something like that, so that then I can manage that anger to express that emotion, to express what's really going on for me. So anger just by itself is a useless emotion. In fact, it's worse than useless, right? It's a very negative, very destructive emotion,
Mm-hmm.
just unbridled. But anger channeled with that self-awareness of why I'm angry and expressing that is incredibly powerful.
I see. So anger shouldn't even be thought of as a standalone emotion, right? Anger should be thought of within the context of some kind of trigger, right? Whether
Yes,
it's injustice, as you mentioned, or disrespect, or feeling like you've been cheated out of something, whatever the case may be. Anger
absolutely.
anger is kind of your response. Now, how do you go ahead? How do you teach your clients to channel their anger elsewhere? Because I would imagine that you have a lot of clients that, high performers. I'm sure a lot of them are,
Of course.
can get
Yeah.
can experience like bouts of rage at some point, right? How do you
And remember that anger can also cause the shutdown. So we work with a lot of clients who, when they're angry, shut
Mhm.
down. So again, there's some injustice. There's something that's not right to them. There's something that's happened to them. And yes, there's the ones that fly off the handle, and that's a big mess, and everybody knows what happened. But then there's the 68% of people who, on average, the larger percentage, who hold it in and don't express it, right? And then it becomes toxic internally. Then we feel some shame and regret. We wake up in the middle of the night because we're holding on to this anger without recognizing what's causing that and without releasing it. In some ways, the person that just blurts it out, at least they get it out, right? They express what they need to express, but
Right.
that not expressing ourselves, that swallowing our truth. I mean, there's so much great research on literally the physical effects that can have on us, that we're holding on to things. So I'm not saying that one should run around getting angry. I'm just saying that, again, when people think of, oh, an angry person is only that person who's, outwardly expressing it. No, an angry person can be the one holding on to it.
Yep.
And then, of course, what happens a lot for them, and I'll have a lot of clients say this is, yeah, I avoid right up until I make a mess. Because then it comes out some other way, right? At somebody
Yep.
else for the wrong reason. In fact, a favorite quote of mine from Martin Luther King Jr. is, being angry is easy, but to be angry at the right person for the right reason to the right degree, that is not easy. So I love that quote. It's not easy to know how to channel anger.
Right. That's a powerful quote. And it's funny that you said that you're almost better off just expressing your anger immediately rather than bottling it in, because then it kind of explodes as
Yeah.
one.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I want to be careful
Well, it's
because
the lesser of two evils,
you know
if you
I I'm not even sure that's true, because now that I'm thinking about it, I mean, I have two teenage daughters,
will. Uh huh.
and every once in a while, I get angry, and it has such a negative impact on them that I wish actually I had just stuffed it down. So I don't know that it's the lesser of two. I was just suggesting that people who get angry, at least they do get it out, but I don't know that it's the lesser of two evils. Neither are effective. Neither are helpful to our relationships. Um,
Understood. Um, you work with a lot of high performers, I presume.
yes.
Um,
I also
yeah.
work with a few low performers. We get some fixer uppers sent to our training.
Oh yeah.
So they're very high on the IQ and technical skills. They're your classic super bright, super smart, but leaving bodies in their wake.
Yep.
So we do get sent the low performing on the EI scale folks.
Well, I guess this question is relevant to both groups of people.
Okay.
I guess I let off with that, but I think it could be relevant for both groups. You tell me if I'm wrong. Um, on the topic of motivation, I am a person who feels a lot of times that I can be motivated better by negative emotion or kind of
Mm-hmm.
negative feedback as opposed to positive reinforcement.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Um, do you have clients that feel this way? And what are your thoughts on this whole subject of negative reinforcement versus positive reinforcement for the purposes of motivation from an EQ perspective?
Yeah, I mean, both can be effective.
Hmm.
This is where you get into really knowing the people on your team. So I literally have had like two different salespeople where one person, they're tough, they're strong, and you just say, God, you messed that up. You need to, they're going to just get on it. Whereas I have someone else who's very sensitive, maybe a little bit of self doubt. They I'll give them the feedback, but it will come across in a very different way. And they need a lot more positive affirmation. Not that the tough high performer doesn't also need positive affirmation. I think sometimes we forget that. But they actually like a little more of the, just give it to me straight feedback. So I think
Sure.
it really depends on the person and how they're wired, what their history is, and what will serve them the best. And when you become a really great leader and coach, even a peer, even your boss, right? Certainly your family, you get to know what balance of those two is going to be most effective. And by the way, get to know it in yourself
Yep.
as well.
Hmm. Hmm. So it's highly, highly, highly individual based on your, I guess, experience and upbringing, maybe.
Yeah, and honestly, your level of self worth.
Yep.
Again, a little bit less confident person, harsh negative feedback, it can derail them. It can demotivate
Like
them.
them. Yep.
Now they still need the feedback,
Yep.
but how it's delivered can be very different from that person who's really confident, believes in themselves, gets a little feedback, and just keeps going. So it's not that you don't want to give the feedback to the other person. It's the how you approach it that's different.
Okay. I think that's actually that's a really important point for anybody who's listening who might be in kind of a managerial position, right?
Hmm.
Because if you're managing, four people who are subordinate to you
Yeah,
and they all have different personalities
yeah,
and levels of self-esteem, self-confidence, etc., you might need to think of different strategies to give them feedback, to give each of them feedback, right?
absolutely. Yeah,
Because
for
as
sure.
you said, this is a highly individual thing and you can't just create a template for how you're going to give feedback to all of those people at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean that is a very, very. I mean, receiving critical feedback is one of the most difficult last 8% moments for most people. Receiving feedback is one of the most difficult last 8% moments for people. And so that is, as a leader, I mean, it is your job to give feedback, develop someone. How you
Mhm.
approach that is critical because that is such a challenging thing, even for top performers. It can be. I mean, there's some top performers that really struggle. Here's what I do know is that research shows that high performers extract 3 to 5 times the amount of information out of a learning opportunity. So whether that's a training program, whether that's someone giving them feedback, whether that's an online video that they watch, they're going to take more information and put more into practice. So high performers do extract more out of, in this case, feedback.
Mhm. Right, because do you feel as if they might have a more stable base to receive that feedback and respond to it?
Yeah, and they've learned over time that feedback is not an indictment of them, that we're all imperfect, and that it's actually an opportunity to get better. Even
Got
even
it.
even if the feedback is given to you in a really bad way, right? Because there's lots of unskillful managers out there. There's lots of
Yep.
unskillful people who are going to give us feedback. So can we still, even if it's done unskillfully, can we still see that as an opportunity to get better? Can we not beat ourselves up, put ourselves down, and use that as an opportunity to get better?
Got it.
That's what I've learned. Because I honestly, when I get critical feedback, I still get that jolt. I still get that little shock of electricity through my body.
Mhm.
But I've learned to, manage that, not take it personally, and look for the opportunity to get better.
Got it. So maybe the real takeaway here is just try not to take things so personally, right?
I mean, to some respects, again, to the degree, but not to the degree that we're allowing somebody to be disrespectful
Fair.
or not include us, or as you say, try to cheat us out of something or be unfair, right? So
Mhm.
we need to make sure that we are still, stepping up and as we talked about, speaking our truth.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's not as simple as just putting a blanket statement on it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're very complicated human beings. Right?
Yeah. Yep. Um, Oftentimes I've heard the advice being given to people or to myself or whatever, um, come to work, but leave your shit at home.
Mm.
Right. Do you think that's actually practical in today's world where we're working more than ever?
Yeah. By the way, even in yesterday's world, it's completely unrealistic. We again, those underlying experiences, emotions, they're hardwired into us.
Yeah.
It's cellular. You know, you can't say, oh, I'm gonna, you know, my fear of criticism, I'm gonna leave that at home.
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
my frustration at people who aren't responsive. I'm fine
Mhm.
if my family, you know, I don't like my family members not being responsive, but I'm fine if work people aren't responsive. No, we're just whole human beings, and that emotional system, it doesn't care where we are.
Yeah.
It's going to react, and it's going to bring all of our emotion and all of our experiences to bear, no matter where we are. So no, that you can't just check your emotions at home.
Yeah, I've always like every time I've ever heard that in a corporate setting, I've always thought that it was kind of ridiculous advice. And I was just like, guys, how can you expect people to actually do
Yeah.
that? Right? Because we're here. I mean, at a minimum, people are at their jobs for 40 hours a week, right? Or they
Yeah.
used to be, at least. I don't know with the pandemic, but um, I just have always thought it was ridiculous advice. So I was happy to hear
Yeah.
that your perspective was
Well, I mean,
consistent.
ironically, I used to buy into that when I was new
Yeah,
as a leader. So I just thought, yeah, I mean, God, check your emotions at the door. Like, well, this is a business, you know.
yeah,
Meanwhile, I
yeah,
wasn't, but I was expecting everyone else to. So no, it's not the way humans are constructed. It's not the way our brains work.
sure. If you could share, if you could elaborate a little bit more, what are some of the questions that you ask in the last part of the SOS strategy?
Yeah. So is this wind or tiger? That's the am I amplifying the negative? Um, is what I'm about to do gonna serve me? Another really good question is what would an exceptional person or exceptional leader that I know, what would they do?
Hmm.
Okay, they wouldn't walk on stage and hit the person. You know, they wouldn't send this nasty email. They would stop. They would listen. Um, and again, those are some of the self questions. So as we haven't really even had talked about emotional connection, but as we think about how we connect with others, in that moment, once you've calmed down, now you can start thinking, but what's going on for that other person? Why might they be getting triggered?
Hmm.
We use the analogy of a bridge. What's on their side of the bridge? There's an understanding gap between two of us. I'm on my side of the bridge, thinking about myself, worried about myself. What's going on for them? Right? What's their intention? Because we tend to assume, oh, they have a negative intention. 99% of people have a positive intention, right? And so we start to think about what's going on for that other person. Now we're getting into empathy. Now we're getting to thinking about what's happening for that other person. Empathy doesn't mean that we give in. Empathy doesn't mean that we're wrong. Empathy doesn't mean that we're weak. It simply means that we have the capacity to have curiosity and understand another person's point of view, motivation, and maybe we can simply validate that. Again, people get validation and agreement confused. Validating is simply acknowledging what that person is experiencing, you know, their history. It doesn't mean we have to agree with it. So part of the seek information questions, as in our model, as we're moving from emotional management to emotional connection, are start to think about questions about the other person.
Right, and that's the entirely that's the latter part of your definition of EQ in the first place, right?
Right.
Yep,
Now you can
yep,
imagine we could have a whole second podcast just on that second part because we really spent
exactly.
right. You see how that works. So in our training, you know,
Yep,
first two modules are focused on self and self management. Then the
right.
second two modules, and then by the way, then you get into okay, now that I am connecting, now that I'm managing myself, how do I step in and have a skillful last 8% conversation? That's
Hmm.
a whole other skill. How do I give somebody difficult news in a way where they will listen and not react emotionally?
Right, right. It's such a far broader concept of emotional intelligence, EQ, whatever you want to call it. It is such a far broader concept than people like to give it credit for.
Yeah,
And frankly, I mean, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say we're definitely going to have you onto another podcast to talk about the latter half of that definition. But this was an awesome conversation, Bill. I know you have to run here, but I really appreciate your time, and
Yeah.
I think I think what you're doing is very critical in today's world, because this topic often A isn't totally understood, and B kind of gets brushed off.
Yeah.
Kind of how we opened up the podcast in the first place. But I think it's very critical for people to understand in the world we live in today. So I think this is awesome, and would love to have another conversation in the future.
Well, thank you. You ask great questions, and I love talking. I am a professional speaker, so I do enjoy this. So yeah, this was super fun for me, and I really appreciate you bringing this learning to your listeners, because it's so critical. It's such an important life skill. So kudos to you for having me on.
Where can people find you online? I think people might want to jump into this topic
Yeah.
a little bit deeper, and where can people find your work? So I wanted to give you, a
Yeah.
chance to hand off to yourself.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Bill Benjamin. I'm relatively easy to find. I work at the Institute for Health and Human Potential, which I know is a mouthful. So ihhp.com. There you can find me. You can learn about our training. There's a free EQ quiz you can take. There's a whole bunch of resources there. We have my business partner has a free podcast on the last 8% and emotional intelligence. So there's lots of great resources at ihhp.com.
That's awesome. I think if there's anything that anybody takes away, it's that last 8% concept,
Yeah,
because everybody can relate to that. That's for sure.
everybody does. It's a great concept.
Yeah. ihhp.com. Bill Benjamin, thank you so much.
All right. Take care, Arj.